Good morning. You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning.
Good morning.
Could you please tell the jurors your first and last name and spell your last name for the record?
Yeah, it's Jerome McDonald, MacDonald.
And how are you employed?
I'm a trooper with the Massachusetts State Police
How long have you been with the state police?
since March of 2012.
And what's your current assignment with the state police?
I'm assigned to the State Police Detective Unit in the Plymouth County District Attorney's Office
And how long have you been with that unit?
since June of 2018.
Can you tell the jurors briefly what your role is as a trooper with the Massachusetts State Police Detective Unit?
I'm currently assigned to the narcotics unit inside the State Police Detective Unit office. And previously to that, I was assigned to the homicide unit.
As it pertains to your work in the homicide unit, what does the State Police Detective Unit do in the homicide unit?
You're working on-call capacity. You get called out to death investigations. Could be anything from a heart attack, an overdose, a suicide, and then motor vehicle crashes and homicide investigations.
And when the State Police Detective Unit is involved in an investigation into a death, do you often work with the local law enforcement in investigating those deaths?
Yes.
And is there generally a particular trooper who's designated as a case officer for each investigation?
Yes.
And what does the case officer generally do?
The case officer is designated to receive the information from the other detectives or troopers or local officers out in the field collecting evidence.
And when you're not assigned as a case officer in an investigation into a death, fair to say a lot of the other troopers and the local detectives all divide up the work and talk to different people and do different parts of the investigation.
Yes.
So it's very much a team effort.
Yes.
Now, I'm going to draw your attention to January 28th of the year 2021. Were you working with the Massachusetts State Police Detective Unit at the Plymouth County District Attorney's Office at that time?
Yes.
And were you part of the homicide unit at that time?
Correct.
And do you recall at some point in the evening responding to the South Shore Hospital?
Yes, I do.
Did a particular individual request that you go to that location?
Yeah, I was notified about 1727 hours by Sergeant Robert Klimas.
And for those of us who might not know what 1727 in non-military time.
5:27 p.m. Sorry.
And Sergeant Klimas, was that an individual who was kind of helping to oversee the investigation at that time?
Yes.
When you arrived at the South Shore Hospital, were there any other troopers or law enforcement present?
The trooper Bill Watson from the State Police Crime Scene Services was there.
And you're familiar in your work with the detectives unit about what the Crime Scene Services section does, correct?
Yes.
And oftentimes, do you work in connection with those troopers with the Crime Scene Services section when you respond to a death?
Yes.
And in this particular circumstance, what was Trooper Watson there to do?
Objection, Your Honor.
Basis?
Of my objection.
Yes.
We still don't have a foundation as to how he would know why Trooper Watson was sent there or how he learned that, which could possibly be secondhand information.
Lay the foundation.
Trooper McDonald, when a death occurs in any town in Plymouth County, is it fair to say that a member of the Crime Scene Services section comes out to the scene?
Yes.
And what do Crime Scene Services section, what do they do?
They process the scene for fingerprints, photographs.
And in a situation where a trooper comes out to photograph a scene, is it fair to say that sometimes there are multiple places that troopers are designated or dispatched to go to photograph scenes in this type of investigation?
Yes.
And so when you were called to respond to the South Shore Hospital, were you aware that a member of the Crime Scene Services was also dispatched to the hospital?
Objection.
If he was aware.
Aware of if they were dispatched prior to my receiving the call? Or?
Well, at any point on your way to the South Shore Hospital, Were you aware that somebody from crime scene service is going to meet you there?
Usually that's part of, I don't take the picture, so usually they do meet me there, yes.
Okay. And in this particular circumstances, when you arrived at South Shore Hospital, did you see Trooper Watson?
Yes.
And have you worked with Trooper Watson before?
Yes.
Have you had the experience to observe him document individuals or scenes with photographs before?
Yes, I have.
And so when you were at the South Shore Hospital, where were you directed to go when you arrived at the hospital?
When I got to the hospital, I met with medical staff, and then they directed me to the room that Mr. Ricci was.
And did Trooper Watson accompany you to that room?
Yes.
And did you make observations of Mr. Ricci?
Yes, I did.
Was he alive or was he already deceased?
He was deceased at that time.
And was Trooper Watson with you in the room?
Yes, he was.
What did you observe Trooper Watson do when you were both in the room with Mr. Ricci's body?
He was taking digital pictures of Mr. Ricci, and he attempted to put brown bags on Mr. Ricci's hands.
Were you able to make observations of Mr. Ricci's body?
Yes.
And did anything stand out to you on his body?
Yes.
What did you observe?
I observed a wound to his left upper breast, a wound to the back of his shoulder blade here. I observed a wound to this, another wound to this part of the back.
And just for purpose of the record, you're gesturing to the jury to the middle area of your back, correct?
Yes.
Is that where you saw an injury or some sort of mark on Mr. Ricci?
Yeah, these three areas were injuries that were consistent with a sharp object.
Objection.
Overruled. Just your observations of what you saw.
As far as the wound to the front of Mr. Ricci's body and his chest area that you described, what were your observations of that particular wound?
This one, there was a hole, and there was blood kind of around that hole, dried blood.
And as far as the wound that you indicated was on his rear left shoulder, what were your observations of that wound?
This one here was a dark red wound in his, right in this part of the shoulder blade.
Okay. And the wound that you described on his back, did that look different than the two wounds that you just previously described?
Yeah, the one on the back was just a little lighter. Didn't seem like it was as deep as the other two.
Okay. And was that wound on the back significantly longer than the other two wounds you observed?
I can't say at this time.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that Trooper Watson was photographing the body and that he bagged his hands. Are you familiar with what he was doing when Trooper Watson bagged the hands?
Yes. Specifically on the right hand, there was a couple marks, small shot marks, and Trooper Watson was bagging the hands to preserve any type of possible biological or DNA evidence on his hands.
And before the bags were placed over Mr. Ricci's hands, did you observe those marks that you described yourself?
I observed them, yes.
Okay. Now, again, at that point, you had learned that Mr. Ricci had already expired.
That's correct.
Did you take custody of any particular items from the hospital that were that had belonged to Mr. Ricci?
Yes, it was the items that was on Mr. Ricci's person at the time.
Okay. And was there clothing that was provided to you by hospital staff?
Yes, there was.
And was there a personal item, like a wallet, that was provided to you by hospital staff?
Yes, it was footwear, pants, a wallet, belt, I believe a phone, and 2 shirts.
And why did you take custody of those particular items?
To take custody to transport them to the chemist.
And as far as the items that you described as there were 2 shirts, do you recall seeing those 2 shirts before collecting those items from the hospital staff?
They're usually, when I get there, they're usually bagged up at that point, but I know they were dark colored shirts.
Okay. And when you take custody of a particular item, you're responsible for them until they get to the next person in the chain of custody. Is that fair to say?
Correct.
And so you would have looked at those shirts prior to collecting them to take custody of them?
Correct. I would have kept them in the bag, though.
Okay. Your Honor, at this time, if I may retrieve some items to show the witness.
You may.
If I may approach the witness.
You may.
Trooper, I'm just showing you an item. Can you see the item from where you're sitting?
Yes.
Are you familiar with this particular item?
Yes.
And what do you know this item to be?
That's the short sleeve shirt that Mr. Ricci was wearing.
Okay, and again, you retrieved this particular item from the hospital staff after it had been removed from Mr. Ricci by hospital staff on January 28, 2021?
Correct.
At this time, Your Honor, I would move to admit this as the next exhibit.
Is there an objection?
No, Your Honor.
Are we at Exhibit 30?
34. And Trooper, you indicated there was a second shirt that was in Mr. Ricci's property, correct?
Yes.
If I may approach.
You may.
Showing you another item. Is that familiar to you?
Yes.
And what do you know this item to be?
That'd be the long sleeve shirt.
And fair to say this is the second shirt you described that you received from hospital staff with Mr. Ricci's belongings on January 28th, 2021?
Correct.
I would move to admit this as the next exhibit.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
Will be marked and admitted as Exhibit 31.
Now, once you collected the items from the hospital, including what's now been marked as exhibit number 30 and 31, as well as the other items you described, you indicated that you took those back and provided them to a member of the crime scene team.
Yes.
Do you recall who you gave them to?
I apologize. I can't remember at this very moment.
Okay, but is it fair to say that there are usually forensic scientists as well that come out to the scene that collect the items and bring them back to the lab?
Yes.
And in this case, you're aware that there was a member of the crime scene response team that was a forensic scientist who was collecting items, including clothing and swabs from the scenes.
Correct.
Now, while you were at the hospital, did you see and speak to Angel Ricci and Michael Ricci Jr.?
Yes.
And in your conversations with Angel and Michael, did you determine whether they had been at the home where the original incident occurred that night?
I do not believe they were home at the time of the incident, no.
Okay. And as far as what you observed of Mr. Ricci's body at the hospital and the items you collected, as well as your conversations with Angel and Michael Jr. at the hospital, did you report all that information back to the supervising sergeant and case officer on this case?
Yes.
And fair to say that's all that you yourself did on the evening of January 28th, 2021 in regards to this investigation?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Cross-exam.
One moment, Your Honor.
Sure.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, sir.
The mark on Mr. Ricci's lower back that you mentioned, that was just sort of a scratch mark, right? It wasn't deep.
It wasn't deeper. It wasn't as deep as the other two, correct?
And it wasn't. It was already scabbed over when you saw it, correct?
I don't recall the scab being there.
You recall it being an opened, bleeding wound when you saw it?
I didn't see any blood in that area. It was more of like a scrape. And it wasn't as deep as the other two. So
it was like a scrape, almost like a scratch.
I didn't see any like fingernail scratches. It looked more like a sharp object scratch.
What's previously been marked is exhibit number 31. That's the back of the shirt. Is there any cut mark at the bottom?
Could you just bring it over here for me, sir?
May I approach you?
You certainly may.
I can't see anything from that angle, no.
I'm going to show you what's been marked as exhibit number 30, the back of the shirt. May I approach?
You may.
See any cuts at the bottom of that t-shirt?
No, sir. No, sir.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Any redirect?
Just one question. Trooper, when you received those particular shirts from the hospital, they weren't in the manner in which they're presented in those two exhibits, correct?
Correct.
And did you take it out and inspect the shirts to determine where the cut marks, or if there were any cut marks on those items?
No, I'll leave that to the chemist.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Nothing further.
The witness may step down. The Commonwealth may call its next witness.
The Commonwealth would call Peter Bankston to the stand, please.
Sir, please
Do you solemnly swear that the testimony in the evidence report from the jury in the matter now coming from the Commonwealth and the defendant bar to the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, sir. You may proceed.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Could you please tell the jurors your first and last name and spell your last name for the record?
Yes, my name is Peter Bankson, and it's spelled Bengtson.
And how are you employed, sir?
I'm employed with the Massachusetts State Police.
And what's your current assignment with the state police?
I'm a lieutenant and executive officer of the Crime Scene Services section based out of Maynard.
How long have you been with the state police?
I've been with Massachusetts State Police almost 23 years now.
And how long have you been with the Crime Scene Services section?
15 of those years.
Do you have to undergo any sort of specialized training to be a member of the Crime Scene Services section as a trooper?
Yes. Upon being selected for Crime Scene Services, an application process for this unit, you're assigned a initial 4-month training that's mostly handled with in-house training officers, as well as readings, competency tests, and practicals to show that you're proficient within the discipline of crime scene response in processing. Upon completion of that, you're now authorized to respond to crime scenes, and you can start attending scenes that we typically go to, unattended deaths, homicides, things like that. There are other disciplines within crime scene, such as fingerprint comparison, impression comparison of tire tracks in footwear, which requires a continuation of training throughout to get authorization to do comparative analysis within those disciplines. So under the Massachusetts State Police Lab, which is accredited, we're required to go through processes for all these, and our training is ongoing throughout our whole career. Even though we might get these authorizations completed at a certain time frame, we're required each year to complete training. My 15 years, I've done well over 1,000 hours of in-class training.
And so the training that you do in the different disciplines that you learn about as a crime scene services trooper, how does that translate into real world work when you respond to a crime scene? What kinds of things do you guys do at crime scenes?
So crime scene services, our basic responsibility is responding to scene and acting as a support service for the investigative arm of law enforcement agencies. So the state police, local law enforcement, as well as sometimes even federal law enforcement, we can work with them. And our responsibility there is to document the scene with digital photographs, possibly video the scene, process the scene for impression evidence such as fingerprints, footwear track, entire track impression evidence to capture that for potential further analysis for an identification down the road.
And when a member of the crime scene services section is called out to a scene, are there usually just is there one trooper usually called out, or are multiple troopers called out?
Depending on the significance of the scene. Our typical call out is just a death investigation that may or may not be suspicious. That might be one trooper. However, if there's circumstances that suggest that this is the taking of a life by another, a homicide, additional troopers will be assigned to take on various roles. So usually it's 3 to 4, depending again on the type of scene, the amount of scenes, location of the scene. As we understand the amount of evidence available, we'll adjust appropriately. But in general, I'd say 3 to 4 will respond to a typical residential in-house homicide.
And the members of the crime scene services section are generally sworn troopers with the Massachusetts State Police. Is that fair to say?
For crime scene services section, yes. However, there are civilian components such as the crime scene response unit that handles the biological evidence. So there are additional people that may come if it's a scene involving ballistics or firearms. The firearms identification would also assist us, and we're all under the same umbrella of the Massachusetts State Police Lab.
And as far as the crime scene response unit, you mentioned that those individuals are generally civilians or scientists, correct?
Yes, they're trained scientists, usually in biology or chemistry background.
And do you and the other troopers in the crime scene services section work in connection with the response team personnel when processing crime scenes? Yes,
we'll work hand in hand and decipher the scene and decide how they appropriately approach a scene and capture the most evidence available.
And currently, you are identified as kind of a supervisor in the crime scene services section. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that would be fair.
How does your role as a supervisor differ from some of the other troopers in the section?
Well, at the time of this investigation, I was a sergeant. I was more of what we call a first-line supervisor, where I have really hands-on direct supervision over the analysts working a scene. And making decisions on how to approach the scene and things like that. Now, as a lieutenant, more administrative. However, I still respond to scenes. I mentioned that the lab is accredited. I have a vast amount of my work is working with the civilian component of the lab to ensure that the lab is following the standardization that accreditation requires. In other words, following the set rules of
we're past the scope of the question, and now we're just accrediting things.
All right. I think it's cumulative of testimony that we've already heard. You can move on.
Lieutenant Bankston, I'm going to draw your attention to January 28th, 2021.
Yes.
Do you recall responding to Marshfield on that particular evening?
I do.
And you indicated at that time you were a sergeant.
Yes.
Do you recall being called out to 679 Moraine Street?
I do.
Do you recall what type of location that was?
It was a residential home in a residential area.
Were there other law enforcement already on scene when you and your team arrived?
Yes.
Fair to say members of the Massachusetts State Police Detectives Unit as well as the Marshfield Police Department were already on scene?
That would be correct, yes.
And to your knowledge, had the scene been secured before the crime scene services arrived?
Yes.
And who was working with you as far as members of the crime scene services section and the response team on that particular evening?
I had Trooper Tom Loughran, Trooper William Watson, and chemist or forensic scientist Amy Joy. And
what was your role that evening on scene?
My role was to just supervise the actual process of processing the scene.
And as far as Trooper Watson, what was his role that night?
Trooper Watson, I believe, did a diagram as well as videotaped the scene.
How about Trooper Loughran?
I believe Trooper Loughran was the case officer where he photographed the scene.
And you mentioned Amy Joy was the forensic scientist, correct?
Yes, so she'd be working on biologicals from the scene.
Okay. Now, did you do anything substantive as it pertains to processing this particular crime scene?
Yes.
Well, let me ask you first. When you entered into the home, did you make observations of the areas of interest to the crime scene services section inside this home?
Yes, I did.
And fair to say there were two main areas that were the focus of processing. Is that correct?
I believe so, yes.
Well, what were the areas that were the focus of processing in your?
I would call it the kind of living room, dining room area, as well as the threshold to the kitchen areas where we spent most of our time.
Okay. And did you make observations of particular items on scene that were significant to the processing of that scene?
Yes.
And I'm just going to show you. It's already been marked as exhibit number 12 on the screen. Can you see exhibit number 12 on the screen?
Yes, I can.
And that's marked by a placard, correct?
Yes.
And does the placard indicate something of significance?
It allows us to keep a tracking of items that we find potential evidentiary value in, which allows us to log and collect in a proper manner.
Did you make observations of that knife on the night of January 28, 2021?
Yes.
And I'm going to show you what's been marked as exhibit number 13, placard number 2. Did you make observations of that particular item as well?
Yes.
And what particular item in that box was observed as potentially relevant or significant?
The larger knife on top, I observed that there was some type of substance on the tip that seemed unusual. It didn't look clean. I referred to it as like a gel-like substance.
Now, having made observations of those knives on scene, did you observe any red-brown stains consistent with something like blood?
There are very few. I believe there's some clothing items that may have had some red-brown stains on them, if I remember correctly.
Okay. As far as the area where placard number 1 was placed, the knife on the floor, did you make any observations of red-brown stains in that particular area?
I did not see anything that I would have considered red-brownish.
And based on the information that you were kind of learning as you are at the scene, processing the scene, did the information that you learned result in you conducting a particular type of test on scene?
Yes.
And what kind of test did you perform?
I used a chemical called leucocrystal-violet. This is a chemical that can react with the hemoglobin portion of blood. And the purpose of it is to bring out areas that might not be visible to the human eye for some reason with blood being present, whether there's just so little of it or it's been worn off on a shoe over a course of time and it's not showing up. And this chemical will turn the blood impression, if there is one, a dark purple against the background, making it visible to the human eye.
Okay, and is this a chemical that you are trained to use on crime scenes?
Yes.
And how do you use it when you're out at a crime scene? What do you do with it?
It's a chemical that we actually mix on scene. It comes in 3 parts. Once it's mixed, it's in a liquid form that we can spray a mist over the area of interest, of potential interest. It goes on in a light manner, and within a very short time, if that hemoglobin hem component of blood is available, we'll see a reaction to that dark purple, giving us the type of evidence to see if there's some type of fingerprint or footwear impression within that area.
And when that substance reacts with the hemoglobin, does that become then visible to you as the investigator?
Yes.
And you said that oftentimes you're looking for potential for footwear, fingerprints in what's illuminated.
Yes.
Okay. Are there any limitations of this type of testing when you're using it on an active crime scene?
The limitations, the purpose that we use it for is to find potential comparative evidence. There potentially are some other types of evidence or types of things that it could react to, but they're fairly limited. Sometimes animal blood you might react to with it or things like that. So there's just an awareness. But our purpose is not to call it blood or anything like that. Our purpose is to see the impression that it may have been left behind, whether it's a fingerprint, a footwear impression, or a tire track impression. Obviously, this is in the house. It's not going to be a tire track impression. But we're looking for an impression evidence that might have comparative value.
And where in the house of 679 Marine Street did you use this LCV chemical?
I concentrated on the location of that placard one where there was a steak knife in what I would call the threshold to the kitchen. It encompassed both a kind of a wood floor or laminate floor as well as a carpet within the living room.
And in those areas, did you observe any visible red-brown stains?
No, I did not.
And when you applied the chemical, did you observe any non-visible reactions?
I didn't have any reactions, so I didn't see any type of reaction that would suggest some type of impression from blood.
And are those the only areas of the household that you tested, the area placard number 1 in the threshold with this chemical?
Yes.
Okay. I have nothing further.
Cross-exam.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, counsel.
You said that the person from the lab that was helping to collect the samples, one of the people was Amy Joy?
Yes.
Does she still work with your lab?
No, she does not.
Okay. The area near where placard number 1 was,
Yes.
where that knife was laying on the floor, that's right next to, as you called it, the threshold to the kitchen.
Yes.
Do you remember that the threshold to the kitchen had like essentially 2 steps, 1 step, and then sort of 1 step further onto the threshold?
I know it was elevated. I can't remember if it's 1 or 2.
Okay.
It was elevated.
About a foot drop, right?
I would say that, yes.
Okay. Now, you talked about blood and hemoglobin that might not be visible to the human eye, correct?
Correct.
That's called the cult blood?
Yes.
And in this case, when you put the reagent on it to see if there was any hemoglobin, there wasn't any.
No, there was not.
Okay. And the only problem with that reagent is sometimes there are false positives, as you suggested.
There could be, yes.
Yeah. But you don't normally have problems with false negatives.
We don't, because we're not looking as at blood.
Right.
I'm looking for an impression.
So it's a very broad test. It's actually more sensitive in many ways than the more specific tests that you do later on to determine if it's human blood, determine whose human blood it is. This is just a very broad test to determine if there's any hemoglobin molecules that can be picked up, correct?
I don't know if I describe it that way. Again, it's for our purposes. I'm not concerned about what type of blood or DNA or anything like that. So as far as it being broad, it's a fairly limited thing that it will react positively to. So I don't think I'd describe it as broad, but it's not specific as to, as we talked about, the type of blood or whose blood it is.
But it casts a broader net, certainly, than the more specific test for human blood and the more specific test for a particular human's blood.
That's not the purpose of the test, though. So
Right.
I can't say that it's broad for that, as that being the connection of saying what type of blood it is.
No, I understand that.
Okay.
I guess my point is that you put this reagent down to find all the places where is potential blood for further testing.
Yes.
Right. And you understand that in some cases that will capture things that ultimately are determined not to be human blood.
It could, yes.
So in other words, it captures a broader class of things than what subsequent tests do that narrows it down further.
You could characterize it that way.
Thank you.
Nothing further. Thank you.
Witness may step down.
Thank you.
You may proceed.
Thank you. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Could you please tell the jury your first and last name and please spell your last name for the record?
I will. Mark MacDonald, last name MacDonald.
And how old are you, sir?
54.
Where do you live? What city?
Pembroke, Mass.
And how long have you lived there?
55. Sorry. I cheated.
You're 55 years
Yeah,
old?
55.
Okay. And you live in Pembroke?
I do.
How long have you lived in Pembroke?
5 years.
And where do you work?
Currently in Pembroke.
Okay. And what kind of work do you do?
Fire sprinkler testing,
How long have you done that kind of work?
20 years plus.
Do you work for a particular company?
I do. Mess code compliance.
And so generally you refer to that as MCC.
It is.
Did you know Michael Ricci Sr.?
I did.
How did you know Michael Ricci?
I've known him since we've been 4 years old.
And where did the two of you grow up?
In Hyde Park. We're a couple doors down from each other.
Did you have a close relationship with him?
Extremely.
How would you characterize your relationship with him?
He was my brother.
And you said you knew each other since you were 4. Did you grow up together as teenagers?
We did. We went all the way up into the high school years. And after high school, we split up a little bit when he went into the military and I went to the military. It was 2 different assignments, but we stayed very close and during the military. And then after the military, we re-engaged, and not too long after that, he moved to the South Shore.
Okay.
And we were back together.
And for a period of time, did the two of you work together?
Yes.
And what type of business did you work with Michael Ricci?
We were doing fire sprinkler inspections and testing.
Did you know him to work another job at some point?
Boston Fire Department, yes.
Do you know how long he had been at the fire department?
Over 20 years, I believe.
And so when he would work with you doing the fire sprinkler work, was that a part-time job?
Yes, it was depending on his shift. They rotate shifts, but yeah, most of the time it was whatever days he wasn't working and there was no other obligations, he would come in and work with us.
And were you familiar with Michael Ricci's family?
Yes.
And how many kids did he have?
3 total, but 2 of them were his and 1 was adopted.
And did you have any special connection to one of his children?
Goddaughter. And his daughter, Sophia, is my goddaughter.
Okay.
And all 3 of them, they were very close to me. They call me Uncle Mac.
Okay. But as far as Sophia goes, you were actually her official godfather.
Yes.
Now, were you familiar with Michael's wife?
Yes.
And did you know her when they kind of started dating, or were you around when they got together?
Yeah, I was. That was kind of when Mike was working another job, just getting on to the Boston Fire Department, I think, is when they first met. So he was in transition, doing his probation year with the fire department when they first met. But then after the fact, yeah, I did. That's when we kind of came back together, when his schedule got more even. And then from then on, yes.
And were you familiar when they got married, Michael and Christine?
Yes, but I was not at the wedding. That's right after September 11th, and I went to a different job overseas.
And as far as your work with Michael, when did he come and work for you at MCC?
We both worked together for another company for probably 10 years. And then as that guy was retiring, he kind of asked and suggested I started my own, which I did. And Mike came along with me. So Mike was probably with me in my role as owning the company for probably about 10, 12 years.
And then at some point, did you step back from your role as owner from the company?
Just recently, actually, I did. I dissolved it after what happened with Mike and a lot of the.
Objection, Your Honor.
All right.
Move to strike.
I'll strike it. It's not relevant. You recently dissolved the company. Next question.
When you worked with Michael Ricci, or when he worked for you, I should say, did you see him on a regular basis? If he was working, did you see him that day?
I did. It was usually 3 to 5 days a week.
And did you guys have kind of a home base or a shop that kind of business started out of for the day?
Yes, we ended up for years and years over in Pembroke. It was a small shop that was an upstairs, downstairs with a big shop downstairs.
And at some point in your personal and your working relationship with Michael, did you observe a change in your relationship with him?
Yes.
Was there a point where you didn't see him as often?
Yes.
Was that on a personal level or a professional level or both?
I believe it was, it's kind of hard to say. We're still best friends. It's just that I think business-wise, he went in a different direction. He needed to work on some things, he said.
Did you notice a change in his behavior at work when he was working for you?
Yes.
What were your observations of him before the change? What type of worker was he?
He was great. He was one of the best guys everybody wanted to be with him, and he was a great worker. And he was always fun to be around. And it changed. Near the end, it changed. He was not happy.
Well, let me ask you some
Your
questions.
Honor, move to strike.
Yep. Stick to your observations. I'll strike the last.
When you would work with Michael, would you guys hang out after work sometimes?
Sometimes, yep. We would.
How frequently would you go out after work?
If it worked out and everybody was back to the shop in time, on a Thursday, we would get together, and it was kind of our informal session of complaining about everything and maintaining all the tools and having a beer or two or order a pizza and make it at the shop.
Okay, and was that generally kind of a once a week thing or multiple days?
It would usually be once a week. It was Thursday because we pretty busy schedule, and of course his schedule was different than ours, so it was hard.
And did you notice after a period of time, Michael not coming to what you called Thirsty Thursdays?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, all around, he was just not around as much, yes.
Would he come in for work and then just leave?
Yep, he would go directly home.
Did you have any issues with him as his supervisor with his work?
None.
How about with coming into work on time or coming into work on his scheduled days?
He was actually coming in on time, doing fine, until maybe about 6 months before he stopped working with us. He was coming in a little bit late or not as reliable about coming in. Even on the days that he was scheduled to come in, there was a conflict of interest or scheduling.
Okay. And when you noticed this change in his behavior, did you notice any physical changes as well?
Yeah. It did.
What did you observe of Michael specifically physically?
Okay, physically, he looked like he didn't look good. In other words, he didn't look like the Mike I knew when everybody knew, to the point where we'd ask, is everything okay? Or pull him aside, is everything all right? Because he had scratches a lot on his face, a lot. He had a fat lip. He had a bleeding nose. One time we thought his nose was broken. We asked him if everything was all right, something you want to talk about.
Okay.
Objection, Your Honor. Could be heard at sidebar.
Yes.
Mr. McDonald, do you recall when Michael stopped going out with you and the other members of the crew after work?
Yes. It was probably 2019, I believe, in that area.
Any sense of whether it was early on in 2019 or later in the year?
I remember him coming in. It was near, I believe, their anniversary.
Do you know when their anniversary is?
September. And early September.
And when you observed these changes in Michael's physical appearance, do you recall when that was in relation to when he stopped going out with the group?
He may have stopped going out with us a little bit before that as well. He was becoming more quiet, and for lack of a better word, when the guys talked, we didn't know how to approach him.
Why don't we have the next question, please?
In that fall or so of 2019, did you know Michael to be going to AA at that time?
It was around the fall, yes. He started to go to a program. He said he was going to...
Not what he said, but just your knowledge of whether he was attending.
For sure. We had GPS in the trucks. I know for a fact where he was going, yeah. He went to AA and counseling.
And at that time, you had allowed him to use a work truck?
100%.
And was he allowed to take that work truck home with him?
It was, because he would use it for emergency service as well. If there was an emergency service call, he could use that truck to go to the call.
Okay. And during the same time period of the AA and not going out, is that the same time period when you made these observations of his physical appearance?
It is.
And do you recall when Michael stopped working for you completely?
Yes, it was probably 2 months after our conversation near his anniversary. So September, October, November, somewhere in that area. October, November, maybe.
And after he stopped working for the company, did he still have access to the vehicle that you allowed him to use?
I let him use the truck, and he said he was looking for another vehicle, another ride. So I let him have access to the vehicle in case he could get a day off and come work with us, and obviously to help him get back and forth until he gets a new vehicle.
Did you allow him access to the vehicle so he could go do side jobs or other work with fire sprinkler repair?
No, there was no side jobs. It's under my license.
So in regards to that type of work, the fire sprinkler repair work, your company is properly licensed to do that?
It is.
And how about your employees? Are each and every employee licensed, or are they under your license?
They're under my license, and I'm the only one that can pull a permit to do a job.
Okay. And so when Michael stopped working for your business and was still allowed to use their truck, was that a personal decision you made?
He was allowed to use the truck in case there was a service call that he could jump on and respond to and make extra money, because he was trying to save up extra money to buy a truck.
Would those calls be through your business, or would he get them on his own?
No, they come through my business, my phone.
And at some point after he stopped working for you on a regular basis, you said that was towards the end of 2019.
Yeah.
Did you take the custody of the truck back?
I did.
Is now a good place to break?
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. I'm going to send you off to lunch.